the time of the JFK situation, the establishment via the CIA put out the idea that anything that questioned the official scenario and narrative was a conspiracy. Theory. Conspiracy. Theory. Don't get me, algorithm. Don't get me. So the origin of that term itself is weaponized. It's intended to give the impression that anyone who questions official narratives is thereby engaged in flights of fancy, wild speculations, crazy, incoherent babble. And that may be the case. But really the term has no meaning. It's just a throwaway term that people throw out there to try to dismiss actual discussion, investigation, and argumentation. And in many ways, it's very effective as a kind of fallacy. It's a fallacious tool, right? It's more of a slogan. I don't even know if it's actually a fallacy. I mean, ad hominem, I don't know what that would be. I mean, if we really stop and think about this term and dissect it, and then we compare it to history, and ultimately we want to talk about what Scripture says about conspiracies. Are they biblical? Is it a biblical idea? We're actually going to find that in many cases, Scripture is full of conspiracy. Many, many cases, actually quite a few. So I'm going to look at a few of those. But if we stop for a moment and think about, well, what are conspiracies? They're essentially versions of people plotting and conspiring. It's a term in law, right? It's a illegal action, conspiracy, in many legal circles. But one of the books that I'll be covering in the near future is the famous priest, Father Francis Dvornik, who has a great book on the history of the Phocian Schism. If you've not read that, I highly recommend it. But he also has another rare book that hardly anyone has read because it's out of print, called The Origins of Intelligence Services. Now, he was a uniate priest. I'm not recommending everything that he said, but he was a fascinating character, a fascinating historian. And certainly his Phocian book has changed the Roman Catholic view's opinion of Photius in many, many instances, many cases. But as you can see, the history of intelligence services, just from mainline history, is in fact nothing but a bunch of conspiring at the state imperial highest levels. But if we go back to Genesis, we don't have to look at history. Anyone who had, and I have a degree in history. I'm 2 classes from a double major in philosophy and history, not counting graduate work. Anyone who has read history knows that history is full of espionage and conspiracies, especially if you have read, like I have extensively, on the French Revolution. The French Revolution was full of conspirers, full of people in secret societies, full of people who were illuminists in lodges, planning and plotting the overthrow of monarchy, the overthrow of church and state, altar and throne. That's just one example of many. But again, there have been many, many, many palace plots, coups. Those are all done on the basis of conspirers. So every detective, every police detective, when he begins to work on a case, I have a guy I knew, went to high school with, who's a detective. I know countless people in multiple fields now doing what I do. Some of them do this kind of work. They formulate theories, right? They gather together pieces of evidence and they formulate a narrative, a theory, an explanation to make sense of and to make coherent all these disparate pieces and puzzle bits of information, to put them into a coherent whole, to tell, not just telling a story, but to tell hopefully the correct story. If we look through Scripture, we will see that there are many examples of conspiracies. In the Genesis account, at the very beginning, we have the conspiracy of Satan against mankind. Satan conspires to introduce death into the world, to turn man away from God and to himself. And ultimately, this is a trick, as Jesus says in the Gospels, that this was that the devil was a liar and a deceiver from the beginning. When we read the book of Genesis, we see plots, we see conspiracies, we see attempts to kill brethren, right? Cain and Abel. We see members even of God's people turning to whores, prostitutes, and then later being discovered and found out for their conspiracy. In the case of Judah, we see the brethren of Joseph conspiring to sell Joseph into slavery. At first it was going to be to kill him, then they all conspired to sell him into slavery. Joseph obviously then being betrayed by his brethren, thrown into a pit, sold to slavers, and then raised up from belief that he was believed to be dead to a position of power next to Pharaoh. That is a type and image, of course, of the person of Christ. But setting that aside, we'd see right away that this is a conspiracy. In the book of Judges, we read of conspiracies. We read of assassins who went to destroy pagan kings. In the book of Joshua, we read of spies who go out to do reconnaissance and to conspire on how to take the promised land. Throughout the books of the Kings, we see many instances of conspiracies. I don't want to forget also Samson. Delilah conspires and sets up a pretty intricate conspiracy to take down Samson. Right? She conspires with the Philistines. In many cases throughout the books of the Kings, Chronicles, we have palace coups, plots, deceptions. Saul conspires to have David put to death. Other kings conspire to kill priests. Saul also kills an entire batch of priests. Many, many other kings are later also involved in plots, coups, and conspiracies. The prophets at times speak of conspiracies against God's people, conspiracies of kings. But we also have the warning. We have to be careful as well, I should say. The warning. I can't forget the biggest one. Right? Pharaoh conspires to kill the firstborn of the Jews. God, of course, returns that by the plagues, but that was a plot on the part of the state. And then Herod, mimicking Pharaoh, plots the murder of the firstborn. He does the exact same thing because it's the same spirit motivating him that motivated Pharaoh, namely a satanic spirit. But from the beginning, we see that plots, coups, conspiracies, espionage are all through the Bible. And anyone who has a knowledge of the Bible knows that. When we come to the Gospels, we see the Pharisees plotting. When we come to the book of Acts, we see many, many plots against the apostles, attempts to undermine them, to lie about them, to take them down. The church fathers, in many cases, dealt with plots and conspiracies of people trying to destroy the church, to come into the church, to deceive the church, to lie about the church. In the Apocalypse, chapter 12, we read about a spiritual conspiracy of all of history of the dragon persecuting God's people, the church, from the beginning of Genesis all the way until the end of time. I believe that scripture, that chapter, Apocalypse 12, is looking at the whole of human history from the beginning to the end. And we see that it was a plot. In the latter chapters of the Apocalypse, we read about the false prophet and the Antichrist, the beast, who conspire, plot to set up a world government, to set up a false religion, and then to destroy the worship of God, the true worship of God, and God's church. That's a plot. That's a conspiracy. It's a global, cosmic, spiritual conspiracy. So we see that scripture, history, tradition of the church, history of espionage is full of conspiracies. They're, in fact, the norm of history, and contrary to modern ignorance, they're not rare occurrences or happenstance crazy events. They're actually very common. So I hope you enjoyed this introduction, that this is the case. It is the biblical view. I should add the caveat, of course, that Isaiah does caution in one section. He says, not everything that they say is conspiracy. Conspiracy is, in fact, a conspiracy. So we have to be careful not to overdo this or to get too conspiratorial. Not everything is a conspiracy. Obviously, that would be silly. That would be ludicrous. Some people do fall into that error, that mistake, where everything is read in a certain way, version of the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, right? Where we look at clusters of evidence and then we interpret every single cluster of evidence as part of a grand narrative of conspiracy. That's not true. Not everything is a conspiracy. And not everything can be blamed or excused. Oh, I don't have any moral agency because everything is a conspiracy. That's what Isaiah's point is right? Not everything is a conspiracy, but sometimes there are conspiracies. So hopefully we have a balanced historical and biblical view on this. We don't go overboard or crazy with these ideas, and we keep to the middle path, so to speak. This is Jay Dyer from Jay's Analysis. Hope you like this video. If you would like, subscribe, share below. Tell me what you think. I'm sure there's many, many other instances, especially in the books of Kings. There's all kinds of examples there. Again, you could list many, many more. There were plots against Paul in the book of Acts. Paul writes about these plots and naysayers that he had to deal with. But yeah, if you think of some more, let me know.